Why do you think there is a reticence in Christian preachers to deal with creation care from the pulpit? Um, and, and why do you think it's hard?
Say credit to Marney. In 1977, it was the energy crisis, but really he talks about two very important things. He's quite clear about the limits of creation. It's like this garden, and it has its limits. We can't use it as much as we want forever. And so that's a very good and helpful insight, even though he's not really talking about climate change. And there are also really powerful sections of the sermon where he's discussing our inextricable relationship to the created order. So he's doing two things that are really important, actually quite early, before we're talking about climate change. Now today, the lack of preaching on that is a different situation. For now, we know the catastrophe, and I really will say catastrophe that is upon us. And it's very, very late in the game. But as some writers have noted, we don't hear a lot of sermons about climate change or environmental justice, which I think we have to hold together. I'm not sure why it is so hard for preachers right now. I imagine for every preacher, there's a different reason. I'm going to assume it's not just a denial or wishful thinking. I think preachers generally know now what's going on, at least. Maybe it's because the problem is so huge. It's just overwhelming. We're dealing with what I think one of the big challenges is this enormous scope of time and space involved. It's very difficult to preach to that. The dynamics and the powers that are involved are so enormous that the feeling that one sermon is kind of fruitless and what can one person or even one congregation do. It's sad that as Christians, that's often the way we think, but I know I have been there. What in the world do I have to say? But in general, it's been a sort of a slow catastrophe, what Rob Nixon calls slow violence. And there's so many other very immediate issues that preachers are confronting each week. Just look around, that to sort of set those aside and talk about this big long-term challenge of climate change is sometimes difficult to get to. I know one of the sermons that I preached on climate change, that very week, a lot was happening in Durham with Black Lives Matter. And this was the one sermon that I had at my local church. And it was very, very difficult to just not throw out the climate change sermon and move on to what was, in fact, much more pressing in the moment and certainly critically important to me. But what needed to be done then was to link the climate change issue and environmental justice. But that's just what happens from week to week with preachers. So many things are going on. It's also such a politically polarized time that preaching on climate change is often, by many pastors, seen to be quite political, and that can lead them away from such preaching at a time when we're so polarized and congregations are already in some cases quite torn up. Finally, and this will be part confession, we have to also admit that we homiletics professors have simply not prepared our students for the world in which they're now preaching and will be preaching in the future. We haven't, I don't think, adequately included preaching on climate change in our classes or in our reflections. And I really think right now that every single class, homiletics class, every single one should deal in part with preaching in the face of climate change and environmental injustice.
What do you see as some of the benefits of Marney's approach in coming at this problem through these these big theological lenses? And are there things he misses? Are there ways in which you wish he had taken a different approach? What do you think of that?
First of all, I want to say something really positive about his theological approach. I think that climate change and environmental justice will call for some really careful and at times radical rethinking of our theology. like
Yes.
I said, incarnation, hope, covenant, creation, all of those things. So I think I really appreciated his underlying deep theological grounding and reflection of what he's doing. I think he does give quite a few action items, but what's fascinating to me is they're really mainly small individual lifestyle choices within this larger theological framework that he paints of parsimony, which is certainly a word that we wouldn't use today, by which he means the least that will really do. All throughout the sermon, there's all these individual, personal lifestyle choices and actions we can take. So I do think he gives quite a few action items, but the situation is they're just not adequate. They're okay, they're fine, they're good, but in our context now, they just don't feel like much because what we're up against is so enormous, and the actions that are going to be required are not just individual lifestyle choices, as important as those are. I'm not dismissing them, but we're talking about sort of the huge political and economic decisions and actions that are going to be necessary. And that, of course, fascinatingly brings us back to one reason why preachers hesitate to preach on the topic. We might rather just talk about some individual choices we can make to do this or do that, rather than the enormous changes to the society, to the global order, to economics that are going to be necessary to shift to the much lower fossil fuel use.
You talk a lot about incarnation in your new book coming out this month, Scandal of the Gospel, Preaching and the Grotesque. And, what do you think of what he does with the incarnation? How does it impact his sense of preaching on the environment? And what might you add or nuance or turn upside down? How is it that you talk about it in your book?
It was a very human-centered approach. The understanding of incarnation did not change at all because of the environmental situation. But it was just primarily another way of calling us to some individual actions and to think about our own lives. And that's what he does in that section. He just sort of reflects on his own personal life in relation to that. So I was excited about incarnation. I think incarnation is critically important for us to think about. But I thought that he just sort of went with incarnation and left the first 2/3 of the sermon rather behind, except for the lifestyle piece. Now, I really do think we have to rethink incarnation much more deeply in relation to the climate catastrophe and creation that we're in. I've been really interested, and I don't have time to really go into a lot of detail on this. I would just highlight, I've been really interested in the work of Elizabeth Johnson, who writes about what she calls deep incarnation. Deep incarnation is a concept that she gets from a Danish theologian, Niels Henrik Gregersen. And what's fascinating to me is deep incarnation, as she understands it, means that in the incarnation, Jesus doesn't just incarnate humanity, but in his body, he incarnates all of creation, all of it, from the dust down to the every aspect of Earth is in his body, just as she shows and scientists are showing, just as is the case for all of us who are humans. Fascinatingly, she reminds us, and I had never thought about this before, many others probably have, she says that John writes, the word became flesh and dwelt among us. John does not say the word became human. The word became flesh. Yeah. And according to Johnson, the term flesh never means human beings in scripture. It refers to the entire, and I'm quoting her here, the entire natural sphere of what is fragile and vulnerable and perishable. So in becoming flesh, Jesus takes into himself not just humanity, but the entire created order. So now, if I can borrow the title from a book that I wrote earlier, Preaching Jesus, calls us to speak not just for human beings, but for the entire created order embodied in his incarnation. That preaching Jesus now becomes something much more expansive.
I mean, one of the questions I'm left with, I think, is how two things. How is it that sermons, in both their form and the expectations of our listeners, tempt preachers with those kind of false resolutions and false hopes? And what does the kind of view of the incarnation that you just described, a sense in which there is a deep incarnation of the whole world in the body of Jesus, how does that point us in a different way in relation to what it means to proclaim gospel?
The powers that are involved right now, the momentum is so enormous that I think we're going to have to be honest about any preaching of a kind of cheap hope, like God is going to get us out of this, everything's going to be okay. We don't have that guarantee, I don't think. It needs to be this hope a lot more, what I would just say called tensive, a lot more tension in it, rather than anything that would be simple or cheap or easily resolved. I've been reading the prophet Joel a lot. Trusha, you know this. And I think Joel, presents this sort of environmental catastrophe and warfare. I mean, there's all of that stuff going on, but he offers a kind of challenging kind of hope in the face of the environmental devastation. He does speak very strong, beautiful words about God's grace, God's mercy, God's promise, just very boldly and strongly. But then it seems like in the same breath, he'll follow with a shocking word. He'll say, who knows? Who knows, he asks, who knows whether God will bless us? God is gracious. God is merciful. God makes promises, but who knows?
But who knows? God is free.
Will bless us.
Yeah, right.
Joel, interestingly, serves a living God, not a God who fits nicely into our nice homiletical resolutions, who can be manipulated for a kind of cheap hope. I think we live right now, if we're honest, in the face of what's going on environmentally, I think we live right now in a who knows period. It's the kind of tensive hope we need to wrestle with. Hope, to paraphrase from a scholar by the name of Kenneth Surin, a hope that is simultaneously, and it's difficult to even conceive, it's rethinking hope, a hope that is simultaneously a testimony of hopeful affirmation and a testimony of that hope's negation.
I'm wondering if perhaps you might reflect with me on another sermon that was preached 40 years after the Marney sermon. It was preached just recently, last spring in Duke Chapel, by a preacher, Rev Megan Pardue. And I'm interested, first of all, when you listen to that sermon, what do you think has changed over the last 40 years? What are some of the different choices she makes than Marney makes? And are there examples in that sermon of tensive hope, grotesque hope, that kind of the kind of hope that both affirms and negates at the same time? Can you speak to that? At
the end of Pardue's sermon, I think she has a really quite remarkable example of one approach to what I'm talking about. And it grows really right out of the psalm she's preaching from itself. She said, she says, the psalm doesn't end with a promise, it ends with a prayer.
That's right.
Not a promise. So there's no promise given about the future of creation. What we're left with as human beings in that sermon is a prayer. And that's a really interesting tension. It's very rare in a sermon, though, as I say, it grows out of the text. It's very rare in a sermon to say there's not a promise, but we're called to prayer. And so that was a very interesting piece in relation to what we've just been talking about. And I think there are really two significant differences in Pardue's sermon and Marney's sermon. One is just based on when they were preached. Marney's, as I said, was 77. He wasn't talking directly about climate change. Pardue, however, deals, I mean, straight on with climate change, with the growing catastrophic impact and the challenges. And she's very honest about how overwhelming it is and how significant and large the response will need to be. She particularly explores, I think, maybe the central political and economic issue is that's our captivity to growth, to the power of growth. We have to keep growing, growing, growing. And we really, it's fascinating. It just doesn't seem like there's any way to even conceptualize an economy or a politics or a life that's not dedicated to growth. And she wrestles with that. She doesn't provide any answers, but she names that in some powerful ways. The second difference, which is I think the most interesting difference, is the difference in agency in the sermons. It's really fascinating. And you see it in the titles themselves. I mean, Marney's title has to do with lifestyle. Pardue's title is, creation sings glory to God. In Marney's sermon, humans, and particularly even individual humans, are the primary agents in the sermon, though of course intimately related to creation. The natural world is this kind of walled off garden that provides limits that we live in. But the fundamental agents are human beings. Pardue flips that in a way that is really an interesting model for us really to think about. And it really grows right out of the song. It's very faithful to the text. Creation is the agent in the sermon.
Yes.
Not human beings, much less individuals. Even to the point in the sermon where she says, creation will find a way ultimately to sing glory to God with or without us.
Without us.
Holy cow. Notice what's happened there. All of a sudden, what we've been talking about in terms of incarnation, hope may be for the creation as a whole, whether human beings are left in it or not. Who knows? Who knows? So the humans actually appear only at the end of the sermon here, and only to pray.
I want this to be a regular part of my Christian witness in the pulpit. What encouragement, what wisdom would you give preachers who are wanting to move forward into that work?
So I would mainly say, fear not. Be honest, tell the truth, be urgent. It's a matter of life and death. Take risks, be imaginative, experiment, be bold. And of course, listen, which often requires as much courage as anything else. Listen especially to the voices of those who are most affected by climate change, but who have done absolutely nothing to create the problem. Environmental justice is really an essential component, and that's going to be in many ways as unsettling and demanding as anything we're going to be engaging with.